The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a man in an expensive suit who wouldn't make eye contact with her. Inside were divorce papers and a check for $200,000, Robert's idea of a generous settlement for 5 years of marriage and the child growing inside her. Grace stood in the foyer of their $12 million mansion, her hand pressed against her swollen belly, and she realized that the man she had loved, the man whose baby she was carrying, saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience to be paid off and forgotten. He had already moved his mistress into a penthouse downtown, already told his friends that his marriage had been a mistake, already erased Grace from the future he was building. But what Robert didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly imagined, was that the quiet woman he was so eager to discard carried a secret that would bring his entire world crashing down around him. This is the story of how one man's betrayal awakened a power he never knew existed, and how a woman he thought was powerless became the one person who could destroy everything he had built. Before we dive deeper into this shocking true story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, because trust me, you won't want to miss how this unfolds. Now let's continue with what happened next. Grace had met Robert Hastings 6 years earlier at a charity gala in Manhattan, one of those glittering events where New York's elite gathered to write checks and feel good about themselves. She had been working as a translator for a European delegation, standing quietly near the back of the room in a simple black dress, while everyone else competed to outshine each other with designer gowns and jewelry that cost more than most people earned in a year. Grace wasn't trying to blend in, she simply had no interest in being seen. She had come to America 3 years before that night, leaving behind a life she never spoke about, determined to build something new on her own terms. Robert noticed her precisely because she seemed so disconnected from the spectacle around her. She stood by the tall windows overlooking the city, her reflection ghost-like in the glass, and something about her stillness drew him across the crowded room. When he introduced himself, she didn't react the way other women did. She didn't blush or giggle, or immediately start asking about his business. She simply smiled, a small polite smile, and asked him if he was enjoying the evening. They talked for 2 hours that night, standing by those windows while the party continued without them, and Robert felt something he hadn't felt in years, a genuine connection with someone who seemed to see past his wealth and status to the person underneath. He asked her to dinner the next week, and then the week after that, and within 3 months they were inseparable. Grace never talked much about her past, only mentioning that she had grown up in Europe and had come to America to start fresh after some family difficulties she preferred not to discuss. Robert, caught up in the intensity of new love, didn't push for details. He was too busy falling for this woman who seemed so different from everyone else in his world. She was intelligent and well-educated, speaking 5 languages fluently, but she never showed off or used her knowledge to make others feel small. She was beautiful in an understated way, with soft features and kind eyes that seemed to carry old sadness, but she never sought attention or seemed to need validation from others. Most importantly, she genuinely didn't seem to care about Robert's money. When he took her to expensive restaurants, she appreciated the food but was just as happy with takeout in his apartment. When he bought her gifts, she thanked him but never asked for more. She was content in a way that made Robert feel like he had finally found someone real, someone who loved him for who he was rather than what he could provide. They were married 8 months after that first meeting, a small private ceremony in the Hamptons with only a handful of guests. Grace had no family present. She explained they were estranged, and she had made peace with building a life without them. Robert's family attended, but with obvious reservations. His mother pulled him aside before the ceremony and asked if he was sure about marrying someone whose background they knew nothing about. Robert dismissed her concerns. He was 38 years old and had been married once before to a woman from a prominent family, a marriage that had ended badly when she cheated on him with his business partner. Grace felt like a gift after that betrayal, proof that real love still existed if you were patient enough to find it. The first 3 years of their marriage were everything Robert thought he wanted. Grace managed their household with quiet efficiency, hosting dinner parties for his business associates without ever trying to steal the spotlight, supporting his ventures without questioning his decisions, and creating a home that felt like a sanctuary from the brutal world of high-stakes real estate development. Robert's business expanded dramatically during those years. His development spread across 3 continents, and his net worth climbed past the billion-dollar mark. He was profiled in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal, invited to speak at conferences, courted by politicians who wanted his donations and support. Grace stood beside him at these events, always perfectly dressed and gracious, but she never seemed to crave the attention the way other wives of powerful men did. She was content to be in the background, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, Robert began to see her presence as something he was entitled to, rather than something to be grateful for. He stopped really seeing her, stopped asking about her day or her thoughts, stopped noticing the way she watched him with growing sadness in her eyes. Grace had become part of the furniture of his life, necessary but unremarkable, and Robert's attention began to wander toward women who made him feel the way Grace once had, alive and desired and special. Natasha Volkov entered their lives 2.5 years into the marriage, hired as a consultant for a major development project Robert was planning in Dubai. She was 32, beautiful in an obvious way with platinum blonde hair and a body she maintained with religious devotion at the gym, and she had the kind of aggressive confidence that some men mistake for passion. She knew exactly how to play the game, how to make Robert feel like he was the most fascinating man she had ever met, how to laugh at his jokes and ask his opinion and make him believe he was mentoring her when really she was manipulating him. The affair started 4 months after she was hired, beginning with late-night work sessions that turned into dinners, then drinks, then hotel rooms in cities where Robert claimed to be traveling alone for business. Natasha told Robert he deserved better than a wife who had let herself become boring, who didn't understand his ambitions or appreciate his success the way she did. She painted Grace as an anchor holding him back from the life he deserved, and Robert, flattered by the attention of a younger woman who seemed to worship him, began to believe it. He convinced himself that what he felt for Natasha was love, that this affair wasn't about ego or fear of aging, but about finding someone who truly understood him. The truth was simpler and more pathetic. Robert was approaching 45 and terrified of becoming irrelevant, and Natasha made him feel young and powerful in ways his stable marriage no longer did. Grace knew about the affair long before Robert served her with divorce papers. She had found the text messages he was too careless to delete, smelled unfamiliar perfume on his shirts, noticed the way he recoiled slightly when she tried to touch him. She had watched her husband fall in love with someone else in slow motion, each small betrayal like a paper cut that seemed insignificant alone, but accumulated into something unbearable. She tried to save their marriage in small ways, suggesting they take a vacation together, asking if they could go to couples therapy, making his favorite meals, and trying to recreate the intimacy they once shared. But Robert was already gone, already living in a fantasy where Natasha was his future, and Grace was just an obstacle to overcome. When Grace discovered she was pregnant, she thought maybe this would be the thing that brought him back, that would remind him of what they were building together. She told him over dinner at the restaurant where they had celebrated their first anniversary, her hand shaking as she placed the ultrasound photo on the table between their wine glasses. Robert stared at the grainy image for a long moment, his face unreadable, and then he said something that shattered what was left of Grace's heart. He said he needed to be honest with her, that he hadn't been happy for a long time, that he thought maybe they had made a mistake getting married so quickly. Grace felt the room spin around her, felt the baby inside her, this tiny life that should have been a joy, suddenly become the thing that trapped her in a marriage that was already dead. She asked him if there was someone else, her voice barely above a whisper, because she already knew the answer, but needed to hear him say it. Robert looked her in the eyes and lied, said no. He just needed space to figure out what he wanted from life. But Grace wasn't naive, she had seen enough to know the truth, and hearing him lie to her face was somehow worse than the affair itself. They left the restaurant in silence, and over the next 3 months, Robert became increasingly distant, staying at his downtown office more nights than he came home, making excuses about work pressure and international deals that required his attention. Grace spent those months in a fog of grief, trying to prepare for a baby while mourning the death of her marriage, trying to figure out how she would survive as a single mother with no family to support her, and a prenuptial agreement that gave her almost nothing if they divorced. She had signed that prenup in the early days of their relationship, when she was still believing in fairy tales, when she trusted Robert completely and thought their love would last forever. The document had been presented to her as a standard formality, something Robert's lawyers required, and she had signed it without really reading it because she never imagined their marriage would end. Now that document was a trap, carefully constructed to protect Robert's assets and leave Grace with barely enough to survive on for a few years, certainly not enough to raise a child in any kind of security. Robert finally stopped pretending 3 months into Grace's pregnancy. He came home one evening with his lawyer, a man named Preston, who specialized in high-net-worth divorces and had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless. They found Grace in the living room, reading a book about pregnancy and trying to understand what was happening to her body, trying to connect with this baby she would soon be raising alone. Robert didn't sit down, didn't even try to soften the blow of what he was about to do. He simply told Grace that he wanted a divorce, that he had fallen in love with someone else, and that his lawyer had prepared papers that would formalize their separation. Preston placed a folder on the coffee table, the same table where Grace and Robert had played board games on quiet Sunday afternoons in their early marriage, where they had spread out takeout containers and talked about their dreams for the future. Inside the folder were divorce papers outlining Robert's generous offer, $200,000 as a settlement, a small apartment in a decent neighborhood that he owned and would transfer to her name, and child support payments at the legal minimum based on state guidelines. It was an insult disguised as generosity, barely enough for Grace to survive on, while Robert continued living in his mansion with his mistress, barely enough to give their child any kind of future. Grace listened to Preston explain the terms in his cold professional voice, watched Robert stand by the window refusing to look at her, and she felt something inside her shift and harden. This man, the father of her child, was willing to throw her away like garbage, to reduce 5 years of marriage and the life they had created together to a check and some paperwork. She asked Robert how he could do this while she was pregnant with his baby, how he could be so cruel to someone he once claimed to love. Robert finally turned to face her, and what she saw in his eyes was worse than hatred. It was indifference. He said he would support the child financially as required by law, but he wanted Grace out of his life completely, because she reminded him of the person he used to be, and he didn't want to be that person anymore. He said he needed to move forward with Natasha, to build a new life without the weight of his past dragging him down. Every word was calculated to hurt her, to make her feel small and worthless, to convince her that she had no choice but to accept his terms and disappear. But something happened in Grace in that moment. Something that had been sleeping for years suddenly woke up. She looked at Robert, really looked at him, and she realized that he had never truly known her at all. He had fallen in love with a ghost, a carefully constructed version of herself that she had created to escape her past, and now that ghost was no longer useful to him, so he wanted to throw it away. But Grace wasn't just the quiet translator who had stumbled into his life at a charity gala. She was someone else entirely, someone she had worked very hard to leave behind, and Robert's cruelty was about to force her to become that person again, whether she wanted to or not. Grace took the folder from the coffee table, held it in her hands for a moment, and then she said something that made both Robert and Preston pause. She said she would consider his offer, but first she needed to make a phone call, just one call, and then they could continue their discussion. Robert, eager to finish this and get back to Natasha, who was waiting for him at the penthouse, agreed impatiently. He had no idea what that phone call would unleash, had no concept of the forces Grace was about to set in motion. Grace walked to her study, the small room Robert had allowed her to have for her translation work, and she closed the door behind her. She sat at her desk for a moment, her hand on her belly where she could feel the baby moving, and she made a decision that would change everything. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in over 6 years, a number she had memorized but hoped never to use again. The call was answered on the second ring by a woman speaking in French, and Grace responded in the same language, identifying herself with words she hadn't spoken in years. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes, Grace's voice calm and measured as she explained the situation and requested assistance. When she hung up, she sat in the silence of her study for another moment, knowing that there was no going back from what she had just done, that the life she had built in America was about to collide with the life she had left behind in Europe. When Grace returned to the living room, she told Robert and Preston that she would have her own lawyers review the papers and provide a response within 1 week. Robert was frustrated by the delay. He had expected her to simply sign and disappear like he had planned. But Preston advised him that this was normal, that Grace had every right to seek legal counsel before agreeing to the terms. Robert reluctantly agreed to wait, thinking that once Grace understood how airtight the prenuptial agreement was, once she realized she had no leverage, she would accept his offer, and he would be free to move on with Natasha. That was his first critical mistake. His second mistake was underestimating who Grace really was, and what she was capable of when her back was against the wall, and she was fighting not just for herself but for her unborn child's future. Over the next 5 days, Grace barely slept because she was orchestrating something Robert couldn't have imagined in his worst nightmares. The phone call she had made triggered a series of events that moved with the precision and efficiency of a military operation. Within 24 hours, 3 lawyers flew to New York from Geneva and London, but these weren't ordinary divorce attorneys. They were specialists in international law, royal protocols, estate management, and high-level asset protection, the kind of lawyers who normally represented heads of state and multinational corporations. They checked into a suite at the Four Seasons under fictitious names and contacted Grace through encrypted channels to arrange a meeting. Grace met with them away from the home she had shared with Robert, away from his surveillance and his assumptions about who she was. The lead attorney was a woman named Marguerite who had served Grace's family for 30 years, who had been there the day Grace left Europe and had helped her disappear into a new life in America. Marguerite looked older now, her hair completely gray, but her eyes were still sharp, and her mind sharper still. They spent the first meeting simply talking, Marguerite asking Grace if she was certain about this course of action, reminding her that once she revealed her true identity, there would be no going back to the quiet, anonymous life she had built. Grace said she understood, but she had no choice because Robert was trying to take everything from her, including her ability to provide for their child. Marguerite nodded and said then they would make sure Robert understood exactly who he had been married to all this time, and exactly what it would cost him to try to discard her like yesterday's news. Over the next 3 days, Grace reviewed documents she had hoped never to look at again, documents that proved her lineage, her title, her claim to assets that Robert had no idea existed. She was born Princess Grace Adelaide Marie of the House of Luxembourg, a member of one of Europe's oldest and most discreet royal families. Her family's wealth, accumulated over 8 centuries and carefully managed by some of the best financial minds in Europe, was conservatively estimated at over $8 billion, nearly 8 times Robert's net worth. Grace had walked away from that life at 23, after a scandal involving her older brother, choosing to renounce her public role and come to America under her mother's maiden name to start over. She had kept her title technically, you can't truly renounce being born into royalty, but she had removed herself from the line of succession and made it clear she wanted no part of the public duties and responsibilities that came with being a princess. The life she had built with Robert was supposed to be her escape, her chance to be normal, to be loved for who she was rather than what she represented or what her family could provide. But now, faced with losing everything and raising her child in poverty while Robert lived in luxury with his mistress, she had no choice but to reclaim her identity and the power that came with it. Marguerite's team worked around the clock, not just documenting Grace's title and assets, but also investigating Robert's financial dealings. What they found was deeply troubling but not surprising. Robert had been preparing for this divorce for at least 6 months, quietly shifting assets, hiding money in offshore accounts, transferring properties to shell companies that couldn't easily be traced back to him. He had been methodical and calculated, working with Preston to ensure that when he served Grace with divorce papers, she would have no ability to challenge him or claim any significant portion of his wealth. But Robert had made a critical error in his planning. He had assumed Grace was exactly who she appeared to be, a woman with no resources and no powerful connections, someone who could be easily dismissed. He had no idea that his wife had access to resources that made his wealth look like pocket change, or that her family's connections reached into the highest levels of European government and international finance. But Marguerite's team found something else, something that would prove to be Robert's undoing. In his rush to finance his expanding empire, Robert had taken loans from questionable sources and formed partnerships with individuals who were under investigation for money laundering and financial crimes. Some of his recent developments had been financed with money that couldn't withstand serious scrutiny, and if the right authorities started asking questions, Robert's entire business empire could collapse like a house of cards. This information was leverage, not something Grace wanted to use out of revenge, but something she needed to ensure Robert understood the consequences of trying to destroy her. Marguerite explained that they had enough evidence to protect Grace's interests and secure a settlement that reflected her true status, rather than the diminished version Robert had tried to force upon her. But she also cautioned Grace that using this information would expose Robert's vulnerabilities and potentially destroy everything he had built. Grace thought about this carefully, thought about the man she had loved and the father of her child, and she made a decision. She didn't want to destroy Robert, despite everything he had done to her, because that wouldn't undo the pain or bring back what they had lost. But she also wouldn't allow him to strip her of her dignity and leave her child with nothing. She would give Robert a choice. He could accept her terms and preserve his business empire, or he could fight her and lose everything. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here," because this story is about to take a turn that nobody, especially Robert, saw coming. Let's see who's truly following this shocking story to the end. On the 6th day after Robert had served Grace with divorce papers, she contacted Preston and requested a meeting at Robert's office building in Midtown Manhattan. Robert was surprised by the request because he had expected Grace to drag out the process, to try to negotiate for slightly better terms before ultimately accepting defeat. Preston advised him that Grace probably wanted to discuss the terms face to face, maybe plead for better child support payments or a slightly larger settlement. Robert agreed to the meeting, even suggesting that Natasha attend because he wanted her to see the woman she had defeated, wanted to show Natasha that his old life was officially over and their new life together could begin. They gathered in Robert's conference room on the 42nd floor, the same room where he had closed billion-dollar deals and crushed competitors who underestimated him. The walls were glass, offering panoramic views of Manhattan, a constant reminder to everyone who entered of how high Robert had climbed and how powerful he had become. Robert sat at the head of the long table with Preston on his right and Natasha on his left, positioned like trophies he had won. They waited for Grace, confident and relaxed, joking about their plans for the weekend while Preston reviewed some documents on his laptop. Grace arrived exactly on time, accompanied by a woman Robert didn't recognize, an older, elegant woman in an expensive suit who carried herself with the kind of authority that comes from decades of navigating the corridors of real power. Grace looked tired, the pregnancy and stress showing in her face, but there was something different about her that Robert couldn't quite identify. She wasn't the broken, defeated woman he'd expected to see. There was a quietness to her, yes, but it wasn't the quietness of submission. It was the quietness of someone who had made a decision and was at peace with it. Grace introduced her companion as Marguerite Fontaine, her attorney, and Robert noticed the way Preston's face changed when he heard that name, a flicker of recognition and then concern. Marguerite was a legend in certain circles, known for representing the kind of clients who never appeared in gossip columns, because their wealth and power operated on a level most people couldn't even comprehend. Her presence in this meeting was the first sign that something was very wrong, but Robert was too confident in his position to recognize the warning. Grace sat down across from Robert, placed a leather portfolio on the table, and thanked him for agreeing to meet. She said she had reviewed his offer carefully and wanted to present a counterproposal. Robert leaned back in his chair, preparing to reject whatever modest improvements Grace was about to suggest, ready to remind her that the prenuptial agreement left her with no negotiating power. But then Grace opened her portfolio and slid a document across the table, not to Robert but to Preston. It was a legal brief, meticulously prepared and extensively documented, but it wasn't about the divorce. It was about Grace, about who she really was, and what Robert had never known about the woman he married. Preston began reading, his expression changing from professional boredom to confusion to shock as he processed what he was seeing. Robert demanded to know what was going on, reaching for the document, but Preston held up a hand to silence him while he finished reading. The room was completely silent, except for the rustle of pages and the distant sound of traffic 42 floors below. When Preston finally looked up from the document, his face was pale, and he had the expression of a man who had just realized he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He slid the brief across the table to Robert and said simply that Robert needed to read this immediately. Robert picked up the document, annoyed and confused, and began to read. The first page was a certification of lineage from the Royal House of Luxembourg, authenticated with seals and signatures that even Robert recognized as legitimate. It identified Grace Adelaide Marie, born on the specified date in the specified place, as a princess of the royal house and heir to a substantial portion of the family estate. The second page was a financial summary prepared by a Geneva-based wealth management firm, documenting assets in Grace's name that totaled over $8 billion, including real estate holdings across Europe, investment portfolios, art collections, and trusts that had been accumulating wealth for centuries. Robert read the pages twice, then a third time, because his brain couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. This had to be some kind of mistake or fraud, because the woman sitting across from him, the woman he had been married to for 5 years, couldn't possibly be a princess with a fortune that dwarfed his own. He looked up at Grace, searching her face for some sign that this was a joke or a desperate bluff, but she met his gaze calmly and waited for him to understand. Natasha, who had been sitting silently beside Robert, leaned over to look at the documents, her confident smirk fading as she realized what this meant. If Grace really was who these documents claimed she was, then everything Natasha had been promised, the lifestyle, the status, the access to Robert's wealth, was suddenly much less impressive than she had imagined. Robert found his voice and demanded an explanation. How could Grace be a princess when she had spent 5 years living as his wife, with no indication of royal status or wealth? Grace's response was simple and devastating. She explained that she had left her former life behind 6 years before they met, choosing to come to America and live under her mother's maiden name because she wanted to be free from the expectations and obligations that came with being born into royalty. She had wanted to find love on her own terms, to be valued for who she was rather than what her title or family could provide. She thought Robert was different from the men she had known in her old life, men who saw her only as a means to wealth and social advancement. She had been wrong about him, but she took full responsibility for that mistake because she had chosen to hide her truth, thinking it would protect her heart from being used. Now she understood that hiding who you really are never protects you, it only delays the inevitable moment when you have to stand up and fight for what's yours. Robert tried to argue, tried to claim that this revelation didn't change anything, that their marriage was still over, and he still wanted to be with Natasha. Grace nodded and said she understood that perfectly. She wasn't trying to win him back or save their marriage. She knew their relationship was over, and she had accepted that painful reality. But she also wouldn't allow him to strip her of her dignity and leave their child with nothing, while he lived in luxury with his mistress. She had terms of her own, terms that reflected her actual status and resources rather than the diminished version Robert had tried to force upon her. Marguerite then slid another document across the table, this one detailing Robert's financial manipulations over the past 6 months, the money he had hidden in offshore accounts, the assets he had transferred to shell companies, the loans from questionable sources, the partnerships with individuals under investigation for financial crimes. The document was thorough and damning, evidence that would interest not only divorce courts but also federal prosecutors and financial regulators. Grace explained calmly that she wasn't interested in destroying Robert's business or sending him to prison. Despite everything he had done to her, she still remembered the man she had fallen in love with, even if that man no longer seemed to exist. But she also wouldn't allow him to treat her as disposable or leave her child without security and dignity. Grace's terms were straightforward and non-negotiable. Robert would provide a settlement that reflected her actual status, not as a powerless translator with no options, but as a princess with substantial resources of her own who was entitled to respect and fair treatment. This included a lump sum payment of $25 million, full ownership of their Manhattan home and 2 other properties, a trust fund for their child that would provide for education and living expenses until the child reached 25, and ongoing monthly support payments that reflected Robert's actual income rather than the artificially reduced figures his accountants had prepared. Additionally, Robert would publicly acknowledge that the divorce was his choice due to his affair with Natasha, protecting Grace's reputation and making it clear that she was not at fault for the failure of their marriage. If Robert agreed to these terms, Grace would ensure that the information about his questionable financial dealings remained confidential, and would use her family's influence to protect rather than damage his business interests. If he refused, Marguerite would release the financial information to the appropriate authorities, and Grace's family would use their considerable connections in European and international finance to ensure that Robert's business empire faced the full weight of regulatory scrutiny it deserved. The room was silent as Robert processed what he was hearing. Preston was frantically making notes, calculating the cost of Grace's demands versus the potential cost of fighting her and losing. Natasha had gone completely quiet, no longer the confident woman who had walked into the meeting expecting to witness Grace's humiliation. She was realizing that Robert wasn't the prize she had imagined, that he was actually a man who had been played and outsmarted by a woman she had dismissed as weak and insignificant. Robert tried one more time to argue, claiming that Grace's demands were excessive, that she was using her title to extort him. Marguerite responded before Grace could speak, her voice cold and precise. She pointed out that everything Grace was asking for was actually quite modest, given her resources and status. If she wanted to be vindictive, if she wanted revenge for the way Robert had treated her, She could use her family's influence to destroy his business completely, could leverage her connections to ensure he never did another deal in Europe or with any European financial institutions. She could make him radioactive in the world of international real estate development, could turn him from a billionaire into a cautionary tale. But Grace wasn't interested in revenge. She simply wanted what was fair and what was necessary to protect their child's future. Robert looked at Grace then, really looked at her for the first time in years, and he saw a stranger sitting across from him. This wasn't the quiet, compliant woman who had managed his household and stood silently beside him at parties. This was someone with power and authority, someone who had chosen to hide those qualities but could deploy them with devastating efficiency when necessary. He thought about fighting her, thought about his lawyers finding some way to challenge her claims or discredit the evidence she had gathered. But Preston was already shaking his head, already seeing how this would play out if Robert chose to fight. Grace had resources that exceeded Robert's, connections that could open doors or close them, and most importantly, she had the moral high ground, because Robert was the one who had betrayed their marriage and tried to cheat her out of a fair settlement. Any judge would see that, any prosecutor who looked at Robert's financial dealings would see that, and any business partner who learned about his attempts to hide assets and manipulate the divorce would question whether he could be trusted. Robert was trapped, and he had trapped himself through his own arrogance and cruelty. He signed a revised settlement agreement that afternoon, his hand shaking slightly as he put pen to paper, watching his carefully constructed plans for the future crumble into dust. Natasha excused herself from the meeting before the signing was complete, mumbling something about an appointment she had forgotten. She never returned to Robert's life, never answered his calls or messages. It turned out that Natasha's interest in Robert had been purely mercenary, based entirely on what she thought he could provide in terms of wealth and status and access to luxury. Once his vulnerability was exposed, once he was no longer the untouchable billionaire but rather a man who had been thoroughly outmaneuvered by his soon-to-be ex-wife, Natasha saw no future in staying with him. She disappeared from New York within a month, moving to Miami where she apparently found another wealthy man to manipulate and another life to insert herself into. Robert was left alone with the wreckage of his marriage and his pride, forced to confront the reality that he had thrown away something genuine in pursuit of something shallow, and that the woman he had dismissed as powerless had more strength than he could have ever imagined. The divorce was finalized 3 months before Grace gave birth. Robert transferred the properties as agreed, established the trust fund for their child, and issued a public statement taking responsibility for the end of their marriage due to his own failings. The statement was carefully worded by his PR team to minimize damage to his reputation, but the truth spread through New York's social circles quickly. People who had known them as a couple understood that Robert had destroyed his marriage through arrogance and infidelity, and that Grace had emerged from the situation with her dignity intact. Some people were shocked to learn about Grace's true identity, though Marguerite ensured that the details remained vague enough to protect the family's privacy. Grace became the subject of endless speculation and gossip, but she handled it with the same quiet grace she had brought to every other aspect of her life. She didn't give interviews or make statements, she simply focused on preparing for her baby's arrival and deciding what came next for her. Grace gave birth to a healthy baby girl on a cold December morning in a private hospital in Manhattan. She named her daughter Hope Adelaide, the middle name connecting her to Grace's family heritage, and the first name representing what this child meant: hope for a future built on truth and authenticity, rather than pretense and deception. Robert was present at the birth because Grace believed their daughter deserved to know her father, despite everything that had happened between them. She wasn't interested in revenge or in keeping Robert away from their child. She simply wanted to build a life where Hope would never have to hide who she was or apologize for her worth. Robert held his daughter for the first time and wept, not tears of joy but tears of profound regret for everything he had lost and thrown away. He looked at this tiny perfect person, and then at Grace, who watched him with an expression of distant sadness, and he understood the magnitude of what he had destroyed. He had gambled his marriage and his family on a fantasy, had convinced himself that Natasha represented some kind of upgrade or escape from the ordinary reality of his life with Grace, and he had lost everything that actually mattered. Over the following months, Robert saw Hope regularly, as outlined in their custody agreement. He was a good father in the practical sense, showing up for his scheduled visits, providing financial support beyond what was legally required, making sure his daughter had everything she needed. But there was always a distance between him and Grace, a chasm created by his betrayal that could never be fully bridged. Grace was unfailingly polite and civil in their interactions, never bad-mouthing Robert to their daughter or trying to poison that relationship. But she also never gave him the forgiveness or reconciliation he secretly hoped for. She had moved past him emotionally, had processed her grief and anger, and come out the other side as someone stronger and more certain of her own worth. Robert's business empire survived the scandal, though his reputation took a hit that affected some of his international partnerships. He was forced to be more careful in his dealings, more transparent in his financing, because he understood now that there were consequences to cutting corners and taking risks with questionable partners. His net worth actually increased over the years following the divorce, but the money brought him no joy. He dated occasionally but never remarried, never found another woman who made him feel the way Grace once had before he destroyed it all. Grace eventually returned to Luxembourg to reconcile with her family, bringing hope to meet her grandmother and aunts and cousins who had thought they might never see her again. The reconciliation was emotional and healing for everyone involved. Grace's mother, who had mourned the loss of her daughter for years, held hope and wept with joy at having a grandchild she never expected to know. Grace didn't resume her full royal duties. She had left that life behind and had no desire to return to the obligations and scrutiny that came with being a working royal. But she did become active in charitable work, using her experience and resources to support organizations that helped women escaping difficult situations, particularly women facing divorce from powerful men who tried to use prenuptial agreements and financial manipulation to leave them powerless. Grace became a quiet but effective advocate for legal reforms that would protect vulnerable spouses in divorce proceedings, and though she never shared the full details of her own story publicly, those who worked with her understood that she spoke from personal experience. She divided her time between New York and Luxembourg, giving Hope exposure to both sides of her heritage and ensuring that her daughter grew up understanding both American pragmatism and European tradition. Hope grew up knowing both of her parents, but primarily living with her mother. She was a bright, curious child who inherited Grace's quiet intelligence and Robert's business instincts, though hopefully without his capacity for self-destruction. Grace made sure Hope understood her heritage and title, but also emphasized that those things didn't define her worth or determine her future. She taught her daughter the same lesson she had learned the hard way, that real power comes not from titles or wealth, but from knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone make you feel small or insignificant. Grace also made sure Hope had a relationship with her father despite everything, because she believed children deserved to know both parents and form their own opinions. Robert, for his part, tried to be present in his daughter's life and often looked at her with a mixture of love and regret, seeing in her face the ghost of what he had lost. Years later, when Hope was old enough to understand, Grace told her an age-appropriate version of what had happened between her parents. She explained that sometimes people make mistakes that hurt the people who love them, and that her father had made mistakes that ended their marriage. But she also emphasized that her father loved Hope very much, and that his failures as a husband didn't make him a bad father. Hope, wise beyond her years, asked her mother if she was sad about what happened. Grace thought about the question carefully, and then explained that she had been devastated at the time, but that the experience had taught her important lessons about her own strength and worth. She told Hope that sometimes the worst things that happen to us push us to become who we were always meant to be, and that if Robert hadn't betrayed her, she might never have found the courage to stop hiding and embrace her true self. It was a complicated answer for a child, but Hope seemed to understand, nodding thoughtfully and then asking if they could go get ice cream because all that serious talk made her want something sweet. Grace laughed and agreed, grateful for her daughter's ability to find lightness even in heavy moments. This is the true story of how one woman's quiet strength became her greatest weapon, when the man she loved tried to throw her away like she meant nothing. Grace could have used her title and power to completely destroy Robert, could have turned him from a billionaire into a cautionary tale. But she chose a different path. She chose to fight for what was fair rather than what was vengeful, to protect her daughter's future rather than punish her father, to reclaim her dignity without losing her humanity. Her story proves that knowing your worth isn't about flaunting your power or crushing your enemies. It's about standing firm when others try to diminish you and refusing to accept less than you deserve. So now I want to hear from you, because this story raises important questions about love, betrayal, power, and justice. If you were in Grace's position, would you have revealed your true identity and used your resources to fight back? Or would you have walked away with nothing to preserve your privacy and avoid the complication of exposing your past? How do you think you would have handled discovering your partner's betrayal while you were pregnant and at your most vulnerable? Do you think Grace was right to ensure Robert could still have a relationship with their daughter? Or should she have used the courts to limit his access given how he treated her? And what about Robert himself? Do you think he deserved any kind of second chance or redemption? Or did his actions forever disqualify him from forgiveness? Was he a victim of his own weakness and the manipulations of a woman like Natasha? Or was he fully responsible for his choices and their consequences? I also want you to think about this. How many people do you know who are hiding parts of themselves because they're afraid of being used or judged or rejected? How many people settle for less than they deserve in relationships because they don't fully understand their own worth? Grace spent 5 years hiding who she really was because she wanted to be loved for herself rather than for what she represented. But in the end, that hiding made her vulnerable to someone who didn't value her at all. Her story teaches us that authenticity, while scary, is ultimately the only path to genuine connection and respect. When we hide who we are, we give others power over us. But when we stand in our truth, we reclaim that power and force the world to deal with us on our terms. Share your thoughts in the comments below because I genuinely want to know how this story makes you feel and whether you see yourself in any of these characters. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew you but really had no idea who you were or what you were capable of? Have you ever had to fight for respect or fair treatment from someone who should have valued you from the beginning? Your stories matter, and sharing them helps all of us understand that we're not alone in our struggles. If you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone who's struggling to stand up for themselves or questioning their own worth, or staying in a situation where they're not valued the way they deserve, share this video with them. Sometimes we all need a reminder that we're stronger than we think, that our worth isn't determined by how others treat us, and that walking away from people who diminish us isn't giving up, it's choosing ourselves. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for being part of this community where we explore the complicated truths about human nature and the choices that define us. Remember that your story, whatever it is, matters more than you know, and you deserve to be valued for exactly who you are.